Welcome to another edition of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 5, Episode 11, your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. I'm a whore like any other. I'm chasing after the 24-hour news cycle. I map out a segment on Donald Trump's proclamations with respect to the protests that occurred last year over the Israeli invasion of Gaza, the actions taken by the Trump administration, or more specifically ICE, with regard to one of those student protesters. And it turns out that after having done the piece, which I do earlier on in the week, a bunch of information comes out that refutes that this kid who they're going to deport, Mahmoud Khalil, is a student visa holder. He's a green card holder. This episode is a microcosm of trying to consume information, digest it, and form an opinion in the 21st century. We get things so quickly, we get information that we are relying on to form opinions, and all we have to do is wait a good 72 hours, and a lot of that information we will find are either half-truths or complete falsities. Let's go on that journey together, shall we? Thank you to those of you who've been with me on this journey for a year, 2 years, 5 years even. If you're new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting.
Act 1. Are we ready to say fuck the First Amendment?
Donald Trump addressed the protests that occurred at a number of universities across the nation last year, most notably the protest at Columbia University with respect to Israel's bombing, their invasion of Gaza. He stated basically three things. That one, any university that allows these illegal protests, and illegal, of course, being undefined, but just being casually used by Trump, any of the universities that allow these illegal protests would be subject to all federal funds that are sent to that university being eliminated. Second, any foreign student, any student that's here on a foreign visa would be immediately deported. And third, and most notably, that any U.S. student that was participating in these protests would be expelled from the university and could potentially face criminal sanctions, criminal penalties. My first instinct when I heard this was to go off, like so many people have, on a First Amendment tangent. And yet, why I ended up doing this piece was hearkening back to another situation that Donald Trump got himself into when he shot off at the mouth with regard to abortion in the 2016 presidential campaign. Harken back with me, dear listener. Donald Trump is in that town hall style environment. And I can't even refer to it as a town hall because the old town halls, they implied that people from the audience would actually get up and ask questions, even though all those questions were staged. They were all pre-approved questions, and the people who were asking them were vetted. Nevertheless, these dog and pony shows were what passed for a town hall. And I guess I should compliment Donald Trump and the political parties for that matter. They got rid of all the pretense. Why have all these people who are vetted come in and ask these pre-written, pre-approved questions? Too few people are buying this bullshit. So I guess we could just have the same type of environment where we have live people in an audience, but the political candidate just answers questions from a media personality. Trump is answering questions from a media personality specific to abortion and is challenged on comments that he had made about a woman facing criminal penalties, criminal sanctions for undergoing an abortion. And he said something to the effect of, I think they have to. I think they have to. Naturally, there's a huge backlash, and that fed all of his detractors. It gave them the ammunition they needed to go out and say, this guy wants to impose the most draconian penalties that one could impose for a woman who just wants to have dominion over her body. How could you vote for such a beast? And what did Trump have to do? Trump doesn't care about abortion. It hadn't been an issue that was at the forefront of his mind. He was challenged with comments that he probably made casually on Fox News in the years leading up to his running for president. It wasn't top of mind for him, and he said what he thought many evangelical Christians would support. He tried to parrot language that the conservative right used, that the conservative right supported. Trump learned his lesson, and right quick. He very quickly backtracked on those comments, and he's been more mindful or thoughtful about how the issue of abortion weighs on the Republican Party in a number of swing states, in a number of states that one would think are dead red or very conservative, Kentucky, Kansas. He realized very quickly that abortion is a loser of an argument, for Republicans if they're going to maintain this evangelical Christian line. I'm not going to make a comment on that one way or the other. The thing about Trump is he has a pretty astute political calculus. He does run off at the mouth and he says a lot of stupid things. And then he licks his index finger and he puts it up in the air and he measures which way the political winds are blowing, and he often changes to mirror that breeze, or in the case of abortion, that hurricane, that tornado. I have no doubt that there are very conservative elements within the Trump camp. There are very conservative contributors to the Trump campaign that loved those comments. Defund these schools, take away their federal grant money, deport all these foreign agitators that have these student visas, and expel all the students that participate in these types of protests. It's the last one that gets me. Granted, I don't think that schools should have their federal grant money held over their head for abiding by the First Amendment to the Constitution, nor do I think that foreign visa holders should be immediately expelled for exercising rights under the U.S. Constitution. But there's no way in hell that I'm going to support a student getting expelled from college because they exercise their First Amendment liberties. And let me flip this on its head for you, dear listener. This reminds me of the nonsense that was going on during the Me Too movement, where you had people who were accused of some sort of unwanted sexual contact, unwanted sexual overture or advance, and you had these kangaroo courts, these administrative courts that would hear these cases and expel students, expel generally male students over these accusations. Now, it's not apples to apples, of course. That type of administrative action was not adjudicating whether or not a student had federally protected speech at stake. Of course, this is a relationship between a man and a woman that went south, and not to say that there weren't situations where those students being expelled might not have been justified. The problem is, it is an extrajudicial body. It is not a court of law that was hearing those cases. They were administrative bodies that were set up within the university, the bureaucracy of the university, that many courts ultimately found fell short of the standard owed the accused. So although it may not have been a violation under the First Amendment, it could have been a violation under the Fourth or the Fifth Amendment. Trump's edict also reminds me of the early aughts when the war with Iraq was raging and you had this troubling groupthink take over the media, take over particularly the radio. Remember that, dear listener, the radio? Only later did it come out that the Bush administration, through the FCC, sent letters to all of these radio stations, to all the companies that owned radio stations around the country, and gave them a censored list. Play these songs at your own risk. I can remember reading that list with a buddy of mine who, by the way, listens to this podcast and has been on this podcast, helps me with all of the NBA analysis, and is one of the four idiots that discusses sports. His name is Jason. We were going over that list, and it was years after it had been sent to these radio stations, and it was listing out individual songs. So it would have the song, it would have the artist, and it was basically an advisory. I think they tried to couch it as an advisory. You shouldn't be playing these songs. But the implication being, if you do play these songs, the federal government is going to start looking at your licensure and is basically going to stick its middle finger up your anus. You get down lower on the list, which was organized alphabetically, and it gets to Rage Against the Machine. And it literally said on the list, anything by Rage Against the Machine. The Bush administration's FCC sent letters to all the radio stations around the country and basically said, don't play anything by Rage Against the Machine. Trump himself has condemned the Bush administration, condemned the principals in the Bush administration, namely Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, the way they manipulated information, the way they manipulated the media. And yet here we are, 20 years later, and we're facing the same kind of opposition to free speech. As I said before, as I will say again, I don't care what side of the aisle you come down on between Israel and Palestine, the invasion of Gaza. I personally would probably never go out and protest. I never did while I was in college, but if somebody else wanted to, so be it. As long as it didn't hurt anybody else. And by way of most of the information that's out there on the internets, the social medias, most of the protests were peaceful. To the extent that they weren't, the fact that they weren't peaceful was used as a catalyst to break them up. I said a ton of stupid shit in college. I say a ton of stupid shit now. But imagine me in that vibration that long ago with all that testosterone and thinking that I knew everything and so little self-awareness. I said a ton of stupid shit. That it could have been used against me to expel me from college and then face criminal sanctions afterward. I'm curious to see how this plays out over the long term. I'm curious to see if this is not like this tariffs issue where once Trump is confronted with all this information about the implications of what will happen if certain tariffs are imposed at certain times and he starts waffling, that he won't come back to this issue and realize as far as withholding federal money from universities, maybe he can get away with that and the public will accept as much. Deporting foreigners with student visas, I don't know that he's going to get a ton of resistance, but expelling American students for exercising First Amendment rights, Trump is already an orange man and he's going to be a higher degree, a higher hue of orange because this one's going to burn him.
Act 2, once again, I was wrong. The Mahmoud Khalil arrest.
I just did an entire segment speaking to these protests that occurred on the campus of Columbia University. They happened all over the country. There were different campuses, different universities that these protests occurred at, protesting the occupation, the invasion, whatever you want to call it, of Gaza. Trump comes out and says, look, if these universities sanction or allow for these illegal protests, and again, those terms are all open to interpretation, they're going to lose their federal funding. Students that have a student visa who are here from other countries, we're going to deport them. And students that are American citizens, well, they could face expulsion. They could face other types of criminal sanctions, criminal penalties. You just listened to the segment. I was somewhat equivocal about whether or not a student from a foreign country that was here on a student visa could participate in these types of protests that were so high profile, that invited school scrutiny, that invited governmental scrutiny. And I'll admit it, the frame of this story, the scope of the story, the way that it was framed, it influenced how I thought about the issues surrounding student visas, protests, the rights of those to be in this country. And that was frankly because the information that was presented to us as a consuming public vis-a-vis the media, via the media, one of the prime movers of the protests at Columbia University is a guy named Mahmoud Khalil. He is now facing deportation. And the story as it was told by the Trump administration and by the legacy media was that this was a guy who was in the United States of America with a student visa and that was protesting, perhaps only alongside, but perhaps in support of some pretty nefarious types of groups. Those groups that may literally support Hamas, may actually be raising money and sending it to Hamas. I did not comment on that because, frankly, I don't think the facts are out there. It's up in the air. But this was the face of the Trump administration, the ICE targeting of student protesters. This is what they look like. And the first target was going to be one that had a student visa and that was going to get deported. And that made sense. That is an easy way to approach this issue. The optics look good from a political standpoint, from a social standpoint. Well, as it turns out, this Mahmoud Khalil, he isn't here on a student visa. He's got a green card. He's on his way to becoming an American citizen. If you know anybody who's been through the green card process, it's a huge pain in the ass. It's not easy to navigate that process. It takes a long time. But for all intents and purposes, people that have a green card are just a few steps away from being American citizens. The stories are leaking out now. And of course, now that I hear that this guy is a green card holder and not a student visa holder, who knows what's true and what isn't. But the ICE agent, when he confronted Khalil, allegedly said, "You're under arrest and we're deporting you because of violations under your student visa." And he looks at the guy, Khalil looks at this guy and says, "Well, I have a green card. I don't have a student visa. I'm not here under a student visa. I'm here with a green card." The ICE agent is alleged to have said, "Well, we're arresting you for violations of that too." I'm trying to be topical with the subjects that I cover. I'm reading, then I form an idea of what I want to say, then sometimes I articulate it and I change it. The point being, I recorded this segment already, and then the news comes out that apparently the Trump administration either didn't know that Khalil had a green card and not a student visa, or they did know that he had a green card and not a student visa, and they were so emboldened because of the action they wanted to take, they told everyone. They had public communications. They had outward representations to the American public. This guy is a student visa holder. What kind of asshole would come to this country under a student visa and protest the way that he did? We're going to deport him. I don't want to make this the focus of the segment, but once again, I was wrong. I've said it over and over again that I want to wait maybe days, but sometimes weeks after these stories drop because the information is constantly changing, and not little details, substantive information that changes the way that you think about these stories is often lacking for, again, sometimes days, but often weeks. Some of you may be saying, "I don't give a shit if this guy is a student visa holder or if he's a green card holder. He's not an American citizen, so we should be able to kick his ass out of the country." I really think you need to examine the difference between a student visa holder and someone that has a green card. A green card is someone that really is only a few steps away from being an American citizen. And if you look at this from a legal perspective, there are often cases dealing with green card holders and First Amendment rights that implicate the rights of everyday American citizens. It is more problematic that this guy, this Mahmoud Khalil, is a green card holder and is now facing deportation for what is First Amendment protected speech. It is even more problematic that the Trump administration falls into one of two camps when it comes to the action that they took with this kid. One, they thought that he was a student visa holder and no one did any research to confirm or deny this hypothesis. The administration may have been fed bad information from third-party groups and failed to source it, failed to determine. And this is so easy to do. I mean, my God, there are various federal agencies that can confirm this person's immigration status. We're faced with the possibility that we're dealing with 2016 all over again, and you're dealing with utter incompetence within the Trump administration. And the alternative isn't any better. That it was known that this kid was a green card holder, and because of the optics and trying to sell the idea of deporting him to the American public, somebody said, hell, let's just say he has a student visa. No one's going to know the difference. And of course, because we live in the 21st century, when you see stories like this, they're going to be quickly followed up with every public uttering that the principals make. The principal in this story being Khalil, and I've heard a bunch of clips of him giving interviews during these protests last year at Columbia University, and I didn't hear anything that was especially damning to his cause. I certainly didn't hear anything that sounded like it was pro-Hamas, and I certainly didn't hear anything that I would consider anti-Semitic. You aren't going to hear this in many other outlets. This looks politically driven. When I say politically driven, that a decision was made that there needs to be a figurehead with regard to the protests that occurred last year, and someone needs to take a fall to demonstrate to everyone else that this won't be tolerated in the future. And it wasn't cleverly done. It wasn't well thought out. I've read some of the stories that Trump is frustrated that the mass deportations that he promised during his campaign aren't being carried out. And this is a high-profile deportation, one that not only implicates what he would consider undesirable immigrants, but one that was participating in protests that he condemned at the time. What I'm looking for as this story unfolds is why this guy? I've heard the things that he said publicly. He's got a green card. He doesn't seem like the right target to make a figurehead out of. He doesn't seem like the guy whose head you'd want to put up on the spike to show everyone else that this behavior is no longer tolerated. I've seen the reels. I've seen some of these stories about how this kid was affiliated with these groups that support Hamas. Why not have one of the major provocateurs that were members of those groups take the fall so you can make an example out of them? I mean, right before I did this piece, this guy is married and he has a kid on the way. His wife is pregnant. Trump wants to come off as a strong guy. He wants to come off as someone who's not going to put up, he's not going to tolerate a bunch of bullshit. I get it. You're going to trample all over First Amendment rights. There's probably a significant part of the Trump base that would buy into that if you give them a good enough justification. Hell, there's probably a significant portion of the Trump base that would buy into this regardless of whether or not there was a good justification for it. But you don't want to sell a product to people that have already bought. You don't preach to the choir. What you're doing is you're trying to reach the periphery of your own base, and you're trying to reach the general public at large to justify these actions. Yes, we may infringe on First Amendment rights, but it's going to be well worth it. It's going to be justified under the circumstances. I'm not saying I agree with that, but if you're Trump and you're a Trump acolyte, you're part of the Trump administration, that's the way you're trying to posture this action. Just like these tariffs, it looks like there's way too much backtracking. It's bold statements made in the heat of the moment, and then days, if not weeks later, backtracking. The Silicon Valley model of move fast and break things has its place, but politics generally isn't one of them. And it does not look like it's serving well the Trump administration, specifically with regard to the student protests that occurred last year, the penalties that universities will face because of them, and certainly the penalties that a green card holder or an American citizen can face because of them. Do you want to go down, dear listener, as a liar or a fool? Did you know that this guy had a green card? Or did you not know that this guy had a green card? The Trump administration has put themselves in a position where either answer is wrong. That's not where you want to be 52 or 53 days into your new administration. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.